And that's it, right?
Tyven, when you're ready.
Is there anybody else who's going today?
I think we're good.
Okay. All right. You may fire when ready.
All right. So, hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about mass transit. You. All right. So, just to kind of give you an idea of how Americans move, 85% or 278 million Americans drive on the largest road network in the world. We have the most miles of roads and highways in the world of any place. 43,000 flights are handled by the FAA every day, with millions of people leaving the country, going into the country, going between states, and 34 million times each weekday, Americans board public transportation, mostly to get to work. So when looking at the facts, the U.S. looks like it's the best transportation system in the world, right?
Jokes.
I mean, surely with all these forms of transportation, you can, probably get somewhere efficiently. Well, unfortunately, this is not the case. So now I'm gonna show you a quick video why public transportation sucks.
Was made possible by Skillshare. Learn anything, including how I make these videos, for free for 2 months by going to skl.sh/Wendover. This is Indiana, and this is Scotland. Both have a similar number of inhabitants, a similar size, and a similar population density. But here's Indiana's public transportation system, and here's Scotland's. You want to get to Cooper, a town of 9,030 miles from the capital? That'll take you 55 minutes on a train that leaves every 30 minutes, or an hour and 40 minutes on a bus that leaves every 40. You want to get to Anderson, a town of 50,030 miles from Indiana's capital? Well, you're out of luck. The only option is the car. Antiquated technology, safety concerns, crumbling infrastructure, and non-existence, it's not hard to argue that the US public transportation network is just not good.
So I'm gonna give you a little brief kind of history of why this is the case. So, starting in the 1930s, westward expansion in the United States was happening, and the Manifest Destiny drove many Americans westward, and along the way, we built the Intercontinental Railroad, which at the time was the single largest transportation engineering advancement that the world had ever seen. It was really great, and it helped a lot of people get where they needed to be in far distances. But in cities, this wasn't really convenient to the giant trains running through it, and the way that they had structured the cities, it just wasn't efficient. So we had a solution. In cities like San Francisco and New York, horse cars were very common, and they were very inefficient and slow because, it's kind of like a horse car. So if you kind of think about it, the roads weren't paved. Wasn't really much faster than walking, and there wasn't really a high demand for this in a city environment because no one was using this as a reliable form of transportation to get to work. But then they added rails, and this really increased the efficiency and speed. And cities eventually liked horse cars so much that they built 6,000 miles of horse car rails across the United States. Just to kind of put that in perspective, if you added up all the tracks of commuter trains, railways, light rails, it would add up, and all that today, it would only be 5,400 miles. So when they electrified it, there was over 11,000 miles of cable car lines all across the US. And this is great. This is awesome. This is the United States right now has the best public transportation in the world. Everything's fine. Well, JK. It wasn't. And this is why. In 1929, when the Great Depression hit, there was really little demand for all these cable car lines and public transportation because people weren't going to work. All these lines became unprofitable, and all the horse car companies went out of business and they closed. So also with the advancement of the automobile and making it the economic automobile for your everyday average American, all these big auto companies like GM, AAA, they formed the National Highway Users Conference, and they had a lot of influence on politicians. They crippled the future of a giant streetcar company, and they bought all the horse car lines and all these railway lines, and they converted them into bus lines. So also, the kind of to give some background, the automobile has always been seen as kind of like a representation of Americans' personal freedom, which has been like a really big kind of value and ideal that we've had for a very long time. Conservative politicians have historically advocated for, supporting subsidies which can lower gas prices, and they've also advocated for, building of the highway-related infrastructure, making it cheaper and kind of easier to own a car. So highways, roads, train tracks, they really shape how cities are designed and laid out, and it's a lot more kind of woven in with a lot of the topics that we've already kind of discussed earlier. So for example, with zoning, we've had a very strict zoning policy as a country for a very long time. So commercial and industrial zoned out places, they've been really separate from residential, and a thing called urban sprawl, which is the basically the growth of residential areas with really not much concern to urban planning, that's really affected how much we actually need to drive and how much we need to drive just to get to work and places that we need to get to. So Americans, they need to drive more. To create these roads and highways that went through cities, which sounded really cool at the time, having a whole interconnected road system in the country, the government had to slice up neighborhoods and to put highways through them, and they had to displace a lot of people while doing so. A big part of this was the government, they had a reason to evict and displace people, people of color, primarily African Americans, from the cities. And these roads, they gave a lot of ways out for wealthy taxpayers, mainly white taxpayers, out of the city, and they gave the cities unbearable traffic, and you can see it in places like New York and LA. It's just atrocious. And primarily rich white people would use the roads and highways to commute into the city to work at their job and then go to the suburbs at night. Here's some more information on that.
Cars are great, right? They're so convenient. I mean, you can just get in and drive around until you have to find parking or pay for gas or get stuck in traffic. And also, did you know how much CO2 our national driving habit produces every year? 1 trillion metric tons. That sounds made up, it's not. And also air pollution, largely from cars and trucks, causes up to 30,000 premature deaths a year. We have to do more than give people reasons not to drive. We have to actually give them good options to get around. And in the vast majority of the United States, we don't have those. But why?
Ben rants about this for Grist all the time. You should give him a call.
It's not a bad idea.
Hello?
Hi, Ben, it's Eve.
Who?
Eve from work.
Oh, hi, Eve.
Ben, we need you to tell us why U.S. mass transit sucks.
Okay, sure. Well, our mass transit systems are centered in cities, but in our biggest metropolitan areas, nearly 3 times as many people live in the suburbs. And suburbs are mostly zoned for sprawl. Suburbs aren't dense enough or designed for walking. Basically, the suburbs are built for cars. Newer American cities have largely been built like suburbs, and even a lot of older cities, in trying to compete with the suburbs, were retrofitted to accommodate cars, which made it even harder for their transit systems to have enough ridership. So residents tend to demand policies that cater to their needs as drivers. So you end up perpetuating a lack of public transit that's not only terrible for emissions and for air quality, but also just doesn't work for low-income households that can't afford the cost of buying a car and having insurance and gas.
What? I thought mass transit was getting more popular.
Well, ridership is at its highest point since 1956, but still only 5% of the population uses public transit to commute to work. That doesn't mean there aren't cities doing a lot to make transit work. Chicago, Denver, Minneapolis, even Los Angeles, which is the most famously car-obsessed city in the country, all have new transit projects underway. I bet Heather can explain how cities improve their transit systems. You should give her a call.
Sure, Ben. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'll give her a call.
Bye.
Hi, Eve.
Hey, Heather, what's up? Oh, so just FYI, that was a raccoon in the vent. Thanks for all your help with that. Oh, so we're trying to figure out how we can actually make our mass transit systems better. Just wanted to call and get your input on that.
Wow, I'm so glad you asked. America spends a lot of money building stuff for cars, which I'm sure comes as a huge surprise. Most of our national support for mass transit comes out of something called the Highway Trust Fund. Only about 15% of the trust fund goes to mass transit. One way that we could fix this would be by raising the gas tax, and both Democrats and Republicans have tried to do this. However, it's really hard because there's some people with a lot of corporate money that do their best to block it every time a gas tax comes up. You really got to show up and vote, and you've got to do it in the really boring local elections. You have to do a lot of research and read annoying alt-weekly articles and stuff to get a sense of what's going on. The federal money that we talked about goes to state and local governments, and so local people actually are the people who ask for it, and they decide how it gets spent. And you should also just show up in city meetings whenever there's something transit related that's happening. But really, you've just got to use public transit more often. You really won't know how it could be better until you know how it works.
Shoot. Well, I guess I better go get on a bus then.
I don't think we can park here.
Alright, now we're gonna I'm gonna explain like why all this is important. So, yeah, access to transportation is the most important factor in one's ability to basically have like economic maneuverability, and transportation should, in theory, like support the poor more than the rich. So, someone who lives like close to public transportation, their chances of finding like a high-paying job is vastly increased when they live within a 10-minute walk of public transportation. And in Washington, in DC, the poorest have the highest access to public transportation. They understand that. So this right here kind of explains it. So as your income goes up, your access to public transportation goes down, and vice versa. So you have, you know, the poorest people have the most chances of having transportation near them so they can go find jobs in the city. So also number two, streetcars can be a very big economic boost to wherever it is. So in Portland, for example, after they built their new streetcar line, they saw $5 billion in extra added development after that because of it. And this is not only just from like the money that they made from people paying for, you know, bus tickets and whatnot, but this is, you know, the economy working at its best and people finding jobs and people getting jobs and just everything working out really smoothly. And third, public transportation increases economic mobility, decreases the carbon footprint, and increases economic development. So why don't we have more of it? Why don't we have more of it? So now we're going to kind of go into the discussion, and these are the topics. How can we incentivize the use of public transportation? And how would you have done things differently if you were a city planner back in the 1930s? And I'm just going to throw this out.
I would have definitely like designed the city around like a major bus route, like sort of the tube system in England, how they have like these different lines that serve different parts of the city. So that would definitely be helpful. And also having like the smart train, like the train that California is trying to build that goes from LA to like San Francisco. That would be super duper helpful to have connecting cities near each other.
I also think like being because like San Francisco's had kind of the older buses that I think we've all been in, and then they're starting to get these like a lot like very new, kind of like seemingly in some ways as if they're like more trendy in a sense, and so having new and up to date buses that are like kept clean, I think helps because I don't think a lot of people want to go into buses that either smell really bad or like just are kind of just grimy because they've been used so much. So.
Yeah, before I got my license, I would take Golden Gate Transit a lot because I live in the suburbs and I would like want to go to the city to like hang out with my friends. And something I noticed was that one, if any of you have experienced Golden Gate Transit, it is awful. It is the worst. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, like, and one of the biggest concerns is that it's really unreliable. And like I've had buses that were like 30 minutes late. So I think a big thing is like timeliness with the buses. Like people aren't going to want to go on the bus if it's 30 minutes late because people have places to be. And so I think just we need like, especially from like the suburbs to the city, you need a public transportation system that's efficient and that you can count on to get you places when you want to get.
I think also making it so then the buses that are more populated and used more often are more frequent. And I find that some of the buses are known to be like pretty crowded and they come like, for example, the 24 usually comes at around every 15 minutes and like during when people get out of work starting at around 3:30, the buses are usually like jam-packed and that's not super desirable for someone to like go on and be like, you know, squished between a bunch of people that you don't know. So like maybe creating like a strong system that as like through experimentation of like the frequency of how often buses come by the stop would like really be something that would make it a lot more convenient for people and enjoyable.
I feel like the main debate surrounding mass transit is like whether we should finance it with government investment or private investment, and I feel like it dates back to like the Western expansion where railroads that were built with private investment were way better than the ones built with government investments, and I feel like it kind of relates back to today, especially with the high-speed rail project in California, which was being built with government investment, and it went completely opposite the way they wanted it to be built, and it's not even, I think they stopped constructing it because it was so bad already, but we had higher taxes like the gas tax in order to build that stuff, but the investments were just so bad that it didn't work.
Yeah.
So I feel like private investment is something that could help transportation, just infrastructure be a lot better.
I would personally advocate for private planning, public investment. You know, so like government would pay for the whole thing, but it wouldn't be managed by them because it's just they're a mess.
Yeah.
I have a question. So if the mass transit like went private, would it affect the bus fares and make it more expensive though?
I think. Do you want to answer that?
I think it would. I think there would be a significant rise, but especially in places like San Francisco, though, I don't think like much of like the population would actually be affected, except the one it's the most important, which is the low-income population, because the public transportation, like as I said before, it should serve low-income people first. This is like a way to have economic mobility. So if it did go all private, then it would be affecting, in the worst possible way, the most important group. But so it's really complicated.
I don't necessarily think that the prices would go up if it goes private. I just think the money or the investments need to be spent more wisely because they have to make every dollar count. Whereas the government, they have like an unlimited amount of income or money to put into that investment, and just like he said, it's just so poorly managed with the bureaucracy and that stuff that investments are often lost and misused and that stuff. So I feel like it just needs to be better managed if it goes into private.
I think also the way that people pay for buses and transportation is like discouraging them from doing it. Like London's, we use Clipper cards, they use Oyster cards, and they found that like people that have to refill this card all the time or get it stolen or lost and have to take it out every time they pay for the bus is like discouraging them. So they're like phasing into like contactless mobile payment. And so, and also for like cash, we have to pay an awkward like $1.35 or $2.25.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just like annoying. So.
Yeah, there was a like a small article I read that like they're trying to get some companies to partner with Muni and BART and like try to like change the Clipper card system so you could actually use like Apple Pay for everything, which would which sounded really cool, but it's really difficult like trying to merge government authority and like private technology into one. It would be a mess, but stuff like that I'm definitely looking forward to if they have more efficient ways to pay. Yeah.
I think if we mentioned this, wasn't someone over here, like about the underground transit?
Oh, do?
Yeah. I think that's like really also something that's like it doesn't really mess up the whole like traffic system above ground, because like for me personally, like I really like taking the train, especially when majority of the ride is underground, because it just feels fast, and there's no like lights or like stop signs and stuff, and I think that it's a lot more efficient. Obviously that's like a huge project and lots of money, but I think that since your question was pointed towards like it was like if you were to make this decision back in time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a really good investment would have been to start off with the right system by having a lot of it underground.
I mean, I think it's interesting, I mean, France is an interesting case study. First of all, I think you need the government, because I think the initial capital that you need to put in to set up the system is so huge that only the government has that amount of wealth at their disposition, and to just, right? So I think the building of the network, I think needs to be government backed. In France, the highways were publicly owned, were run by the government, and it was a disaster. And they turned it into private companies, and it is now super pleasant to drive on highways. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is there are ways to do above ground. I mean, the problem with underground is that it's super expensive to do underground transit. You can do above ground. In Paris, what they've done is they basically committed lanes in the city that were only for the buses. And then what they've done is they've now then put cops on the street to actually ticket people who use the bus lines.
Oh.
So what happened is that it completely changed people's driving patterns. So people were actually not driving in the bus lanes. They made the bus lanes super effective and super fast. The other thing they've done is they've installed a system of tram that goes around the city, and the trams have the ability to override the red lights, so that the tram is always prioritized, and so the tram just keeps running. The traffic stops, but the tram just keeps running. And again, that makes the public transit super fast and super reliable, and then more people use it. So I think it's this combination of you need a lot of funds to set it up. Probably needs to be privately run because it runs better, and then you need to enforce. Like if you want, there are ways to enforce on the ground to make the system run effectively. I think in San Fran the problem is that everybody's in all the lanes, and so it's not effective as it could be. I think.
You mean like how like on Church Street? how there's like that red lane, and that's only for buses, for
Yeah.
trains, buses.
Mhm. There's one on Geary, there's the Geary, the rapid transit system in Geary that's
Yeah.
planned, which I think, I mean, and it's controversial, right? Because people say, well, if you make it go faster, then fewer people are gonna stop, and then that'll impact the shop owners.
What do you mean people?
Well, if you make the bus stops further apart and you make the bus go faster between stops, then there are fewer people who are gonna be on the street waiting and then therefore being able to go shopping. And so, at the same time, wouldn't it be nice to be able to go downtown in under 45 minutes?
Exactly. Like,
So, I
if you
know.
don't know on the bus, it's gonna come, you actually sit at the bus stop.
But it's also interesting the impact in San Fran of like the car transit, right? I mean, if you think about, like Geary was a highway that was designed to get people from the suburbs of the Richmond all the way to downtown, and it wrecked the Western Addition, like wrecked it. The Hayes, that whole valley was plunged into darkness for over 40 years because they just had the highway just come in. Initially, the highway was coming in where it is now, Laguna, and then it was going to go down Fell, and it was going to go down the park again to go, to go west, and that was stopped because the problem is that nobody wants to live next to a highway, right? And it brings crimes, it brings blight, it brings, so it's complicated in lots of sense.
Are we gonna have another discussion, or should I ask you another question? Can I ask a question?
Yeah, this is the last slide.
Oh, sweet. Okay. How do you guys think, like Uber and Lyft play into, I guess, like transportation in cities, and also like what's your opinion on it? I think do you think people, or yeah, you go.
I don't know, I feel like those companies like really serve the high class, and they also cause like so much traffic. Like on the bigger streets, I see like 10 Ubers just in front of me, and then they also have to stop in the middle of the road to wait for like someone to come in their car. Yeah, and then they like double park like their cross section, which is really yeah. Somewhere to go.
I personally think that Uber isn't really perfectly designed for like the United States of America. I really don't think so. Because like if we have, 278 million cars on the road, how are we gonna like, and plus like all the Uber, like it kind of defeats the purpose. If there was, like split between like private kind of ride sharing and like kind of like a system of ride sharing maybe, like with routes and whatnot, and public transportation, I think that would work great because there wouldn't be, just private vehicles on the road unless you like needed it. But I don't think that it works for the kind of system that we have now, personally.
I kind of think like it's creating like a bigger divide between like the rich and the poor in like transportation. Cause like, I used to take the bus a lot more, like after school in middle school. I used to take the bus all the time. And then like when like in 8th grade, I feel like it started to become more thing where, you started to actually trust that like Lyft and Uber were legit. I don't remember if it was 8th grade, but
Yeah.
yeah. And I started to take Lyft more because it's faster. So I feel like it is creating this like divide in how like depending on your socioeconomic class, like what ways of transportation you take.
And I'm adding on to what you said about like ride sharing companies working with like public mass transit. In Santa Fe, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but there's something called Transit Connect, and it's basically like a bus that comes to you and then takes you wherever you need to go, and it's kind of like an Uber pool, and like they calculate like a group of people and like take them to their common destination. I haven't taken it, but I've seen it around. It's like a small little van like we have, but I feel like that's what some municipalities are trying to do, like kind of connect this ride sharing to younger generations, in order to encourage them to use public mass transit instead of ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft and that stuff.
Is it called transit? Nothing's popping up.
You have to
Marin
Marine
Transit
Transit
Connect.
Connect.
Oh, it's a maroon thing.
And it's also interesting to think about how, and I think you mentioned that, I think to think about how the way mass transit is organized can help sustain segregation, specifically economic segregation, right? I mean, the fact that there is no public transportation in Marin, or little public transportation in Marin compared to the city, is not random, right? I mean, there are people who just did not want lots of people commuting through their towns.
Yeah.
And so what you do is you make it super hard, and you make it so you have to have a car. Yeah, I mean, it's a weapon for economic segregation.
Yeah, and also like kind of adding on to that, it also gets really kind of disorganized once the government they like federally they have the money, and then to use for transportation, and then the Department of Transportation they distribute it statewide into like whatever the needs are. The states then they take that money, distribute it into the counties, and then they will vote on like what transportation they want to fund. So you can have like Muni within San Francisco, but as soon as you go out like you're kind of lost, and you can either take like Caltrain or BART, but then by the time you're kind of out there, it's like you have like small city bus lines and nothing's really organized in one thing. I think that's one of the main kind of issues on where we're at right now of how the money is being distributed to.
One of the big reasons why I like Uber home, even though I live like over like a mile away, which is like really close, but I also like don't want to walk. But like I don't take the bus because I have to overlap, and like
You mean transfer?
I mean, yeah, transfer.
Oh.
I'd have to like transfer buses, and I feel like that's just like a really big hassle. Like I have to like wait for the buses because they're late, and I think Uber recognized like that hole and like that issue, which is why I think it's like profiting so much. And I think like the mass transportation needs to like identify that.
All right, any more things? Any more comments, questions? No.
Nice job.
All right.
Yeah.